Three puppies appeared on a snowy night, shivering on the porch of an old man's cabin deep in the Wyoming woods. No one knew where they came from, but every glance, every movement revealed they weren't ordinary dogs. A strange chip, military-level reflexes, and a sudden call from a missing soldier unraveled a hidden truth. What turned these tiny lives into a symbol of hope in the heart of winter? The answer begins with a scar on the back leg of Lumen. The wind curled low over the Wyoming ridges that night, howling between the branches like a voice too old to remember what it once wanted to say. Up in the pine-framed clearing, where Edgar Whitlow's cabin stood, the world had gone entirely white, soft with snow, muffled in silence, and wrapped in that strange stillness that only comes with the first real snowfall of winter. Inside the weathered log walls, the fire had burned low, leaving behind only a warm glow licking quietly against blackened stone. Edgar, wrapped in 2 layers of wool and a patched quilt older than he cared to admit, had fallen asleep in his armchair, with a book unopened on his chest and a cup of lukewarm tea forgotten on the table nearby. It wasn't the cold that woke him, though it had crept in around the window panes and curled into the room like a cautious intruder. It was something else, faint at first, like a tremor of sound that didn't belong to any branch or breeze. A shuffle, a scratch, a sound too intentional for wind. Edgar blinked himself awake, his eyes adjusting to the firelight, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on the floor beside him. Another noise, a low, uncertain whimper, barely audible over the wind. He moved slowly, careful with his knees and the ache that came with 69 Wyoming winters. He pulled his coat off the hook by the door and stepped into his boots without tying them. The porch light had been burned out for weeks, but the snow gave everything a quiet brightness, like the moon had laid a silver sheet across the land. When Edgar opened the door, the wind slapped him in the face, with all the sharpness of a forgotten memory. But it wasn't the wind that made him take a half step back. It was the eyes, wide, dark, and frightened, that blinked up at him from the shadows just past the bottom step. A small form huddled under the eaves, shivering violently, its fur matted with ice and what looked like dried sap or something darker. A puppy. No collar. No sound, just trembling. "Hey now," Edgar whispered, crouching slowly, his voice the kind you'd use for something smaller than fear itself. "Where'd you come from, little one?" The puppy didn't growl or run. It simply stared, those eyes too steady for something so young. Edgar opened his coat and extended the edge toward the pup. After a moment of stillness, the little creature crept forward, placing one hesitant paw in the snow, then another. It was small but solid, with a sandy tan coat darkening along the back and ears that hadn't quite decided whether they wanted to stand upright or fall floppy. He scooped it into his coat and felt it press its small, damp body against him, as though it already knew what warmth meant. But before Edgar could stand fully, a second sound came from the edge of the porch, a sharp, low yip, followed by a softer shuffle. He turned his head. Another one. Smaller, still darker in fur, its coat slick and soot black, except for the white stripe running up the muzzle like a lightning bolt frozen in place. This one didn't whimper. It barked once, firm and surprisingly deep for its size, as if it was giving instructions. Then it trotted, marched up the porch steps and stopped beside Edgar, head held high, eyes alert. The first pup in his coat gave a small chuff in recognition. Then came the third. Out of the falling snow from the far end of the clearing, near the stump where Edgar split firewood, a faint movement caught his eye. It was slower, more cautious. A smaller figure limped toward the porch, its head low, but eyes unwavering, tail curled close to its body as if shielding something fragile. When it reached the base of the steps, it paused, panting. Edgar could see a faint redness around its rear leg, an injury not fresh, but still tender. This one had a coat somewhere between the other two, silvery tan, with darker legs and muzzle like it had been dusted with ash. Together they made a strange trio. Edgar backed into the cabin slowly, the pup still pressed into his chest, the black one following close behind like a miniature sentinel. The third stayed outside for a long moment before finally stepping in after the others, limping slightly, but with determined eyes. The cabin warmed quickly as the fire revived under Edgar's practiced hands. He laid out 3 towels by the hearth, set a bowl of water between them, and opened a can of tuna meant for emergencies. The smell brought the puppies alive, though even their hunger was measured. The black one waited until the first pup had eaten, and the limping one stayed back until the others had moved aside. It wasn't dominance. It was coordination. Unspoken, unforced, familiar. They weren't just siblings. They were a unit. As Edgar watched them settle in, each curling into a ball on a different towel facing a different direction, like miniature watchmen, he felt something stir in his chest. Not just pity. Not just curiosity. Something deeper. Something that whispered of purpose, of stories not yet told, but pressing to be heard. He noticed the scars next. The black pup had what looked like a faint nick on its left ear, small but sharp, like it had been cut with intention. The tan one in his coat had a spot on its back where the fur didn't grow quite right, as though something hot had once touched it. But the third, the one who limped, had the most distinct mark of all, a long, thin scar, tracing from the inside of its hind leg down toward the paw. Surgical, perhaps. Precise. Too clean for accident. It was then he gave them names softly spoken, as though testing how they sat on his tongue. "You," he murmured, nodding toward the soft-eyed tan pup in his lap. "You look like a nova. You've got a light in you." The pup shifted slightly, letting out a breath that sounded too content for someone who had nearly frozen. "And you?" he said to the black one, sitting upright. Ears now at full attention, you're Ash. Strong little fella. He turned toward the last one, who hadn't taken her eyes off the fire since arriving. "And you, sweetheart, you're Lumen. There's something steady in you even when you hurt." The names felt right, not assigned. Remembered. That night, Edgar didn't sleep in his chair. He laid out an old mattress by the fire and let the pups curl into the crooks of his knees and arms. Nova pressed against his chest, Ash settled between his boots, and Lumen curled up near his ribs, resting her chin on his side like it was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the snow deepened, blanketing the land in silence. But inside the cabin, beneath a roof of cedar and memory, something had shifted. In the days that followed, Edgar began to notice more. When he opened the door in the morning, Ash would sprint out first, always to the same 3 points along the tree line, circling like a sentry before giving a single bark of approval. Nova would trail behind tail high, pausing at the woodshed before returning. Lumen slower, but just as deliberate, would scan the yard from the porch before descending. They didn't play like puppies. They moved like they were rehearsing, repeating roles they didn't fully understand, but obeyed instinctively. Even the way they ate was structured. Edgar tested them by placing 3 bowls in different spots on the porch. Each went to a separate one without hesitation. No competition, no correction needed. It was one afternoon, as he sat on the porch with his old binoculars in hand, watching Nova follow a perfectly straight path along the base of the ridge that Edgar's breath caught. He'd seen this before, not in dogs, in men, in drills, in formation, in soldiers. The pups didn't just survive something out there in the snow. They had been prepared for something long before they found him. That night, as Lumen curled beside the fire, her injured leg twitching in sleep, Edgar reached forward and gently ran a finger along the scar. And as her paw flexed and her ear flicked at his touch, he realized something chilling and tender all at once. These weren't strays. They were something else entirely. And whatever storm had sent them his way, whatever story they carried in the quiet discipline of their little bodies, it had only just begun to reach his doorstep. Because just before he turned in, just as he dimmed the lantern, Nova lifted her head toward the window and let out a sound too soft to be a bark and too focused to be a whimper. A low growl filled with memory, caution, and recognition. And Edgar, standing frozen beside the hearth, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, perhaps even following the trail they'd left behind. 4 months ago, before the snow thickened into a second skin across the mountains, before Nova, Ash, and Lumen ever curled by his fireplace, like they had always belonged there, Edgar Whitlow had driven down the same winding road he'd taken every week for nearly 3 decades. Highway 14 stretched out like a pale ribbon through the Wyoming wilderness. Quiet and unchanging, flanked by trees that had watched generations rise and fall. On that particular day, the storm had rolled in early, fierce and unexpected, blanketing the hills faster than any forecast dared to predict. He remembered gripping the wheel tightly, his old truck groaning against the wind tires, kissing the edges of packed snow as visibility narrowed into a tunnel of white. He'd been thinking about the firewood he hadn't yet chopped, the radio that needed tuning, and the silence that had settled into his life like fog since Mary passed 5 winters earlier. But none of those thoughts stayed with him once he saw them. At first he thought it was debris, 3 shapes huddled together in a drift by the shoulder, half covered in snow, too still, too small. He nearly passed them, his truck sliding a little as he braked. It was only when he backed up and opened the door that the wind carried to him the sound he would never forget. A tiny whine, high and barely there, like a whisper from something on the edge of giving up. He stepped into the cold, his boots sinking into the icy crust, and knelt down beside the trio. They weren't dead, but they were close. 3 puppies locked together in a kind of survival knot. The black one, Ash, though he didn't yet have a name, was partially on top, as if shielding the others from the wind. The silvery one, with the wounded leg, Lumen, lay beneath the tan pup who would become Nova. Their bodies pressed so tightly together, it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. He reached out carefully, expecting the kind of panic most strays gave when touched. But they didn't move. They were conscious, but too weak, too cold to resist. Edgar saw their eyes. All 3 sets peeking through clumped fur and ice, watching him with a look that wasn't fear or pain, but something closer to calculation. Assessment. The instinct hit him like lightning. They're not wild. They're trained. He gathered them up with practiced hands, layering them inside the emergency blanket he always kept behind the seat. Even in that moment, he noticed something strange. Each pup had a collar leather thick, not the kind you buy in a pet store. Each had a metal tag, but when he wiped them off, the etchings were either missing or had been deliberately worn away. The numbers were partially ground down, like someone had taken a file to them. But it wasn't done hastily, it was methodical. The black pup's tag had the faint outline of an emblem, something that looked vaguely like a crest or insignia, but most of it had been erased. The other 2 bore nothing but half-legible fragments of numbers, and each collar had a small square ridge beneath the leather microchips. Edgar had once volunteered with animal rescue after a wildfire swept through Teton Pass. He knew the look of chipped pets of branded dogs. But these weren't family pets. The collars were military grade, and the chips didn't feel like civilian models. He should have called someone. Should have alerted the ranger station or animal control, or at the very least reported the find. But standing on that roadside, snow cutting sideways across his face, the wind screaming through the trees like a warning, Edgar had felt something old stir in his gut. They're running. From what I don't know. But someone wanted them to disappear. That instinct had saved his life more than once in his younger years, and he'd learned to trust it without needing to explain it. He wrapped them tighter, laid them gently on the passenger seat beside him, and started the long, slow drive home. Back at the cabin, he turned the fireplace into a triage center. Towels, warm broth, antibiotic cream. His fingers moved with steadiness and care, though his thoughts raced behind his weathered eyes. Nova had a shallow gash near the shoulder, crusted over, but likely days old. Lumen's leg was swollen at the joint, stiff and tender. Though she didn't yelp when he touched it, just looked at him as if daring him to do it wrong. And Ash, the black one, had a burn mark beneath his chin. A small, deliberate circle like something pressed there and held just long enough to sear memory into skin. They didn't bark. They didn't whine. They watched. In the first 2 days, Edgar barely left the cabin. The storm had closed the pass behind his land, and even if it hadn't, he wasn't ready to bring them into town. He wasn't sure what he'd say. That he found 3 puppies behaving like they'd come out of a tactical training facility, because even as they healed faster than he'd expected, other things became obvious. Ash didn't just move quickly. He patrolled. Circles around the living room. Stops at doors and windows, always facing outward. Nova followed but never led. She paused near Edgar more often than the others, watching his hands, learning what his next movement might be. And Lumen, injured and quiet, always took the highest vantage. On top of the couch backrest, by the window ledge, underneath the porch roof. She tracked motion like it was her second language. On the 3rd morning, Edgar decided to test a theory. He stood in the middle of the cabin and raised his right hand sharply. Ash sat immediately. He switched to a closed fist. Nova laid down. He turned the palm outward. Lumen froze tail down, head tilted, eyes narrowed like she was waiting for the next cue. Edgar let out a long breath and shook his head. It wasn't just that they knew commands. It was that they anticipated them. Over the following week, he took note of each quirk, each repetition. He began keeping a small notebook. Day 4. Ash waits 5 seconds after Nova moves, then follows behind. Never walks in front. Day 5. Lumen barks once, never more. Always short. Alert style. Day 6. When I kneel, Nova moves to my right. Every time. Positioning. He remembered something Mary used to say when they watched military dogs at the base years ago. They're not just trained, they're programmed with care. The thought returned to him now, growing louder. Who trained them, who erased their tags, and why leave them in a blizzard with no trail behind? That night, he sat with them beside the fire, the warmth creeping back into their bodies, and tried to imagine their story in reverse. 3 pups, no more than a few months old, already responding to military-style hand signals, already forming patrol routes, already watching the door like they expected something on the other side. Somewhere, someone taught them how to behave like soldiers. But somewhere along the line, someone tried to make sure they'd never be found. He didn't ask the questions aloud, just sat and let the fire crackle and the wind push against the windows. And in the quiet space between those sounds, the puppies shifted closer. Nova placed her head across his boot. Ash sat by the front door, alert. And Lumen, quiet and steady, rested her scarred leg across his thigh, like she'd always known that this place, this man, this fire, this was the last stop. He reached forward and scratched behind her ear, watching the way her eyes softened just a little. "Who are you really?" he asked softly, more to himself than them. None of them answered. But the way they breathed, slow and deep in the glow of the fire, made it clear. Whatever lives they had before the storm, whatever mission or place or plan they once belonged to, it was gone. And whatever came next would begin here on the old road, where the only footprints now visible were the ones they'd left behind. The first thaw came quietly that year, a softening of the snow around the edges of the cabin, and the first trickle of water off the eaves. It was the kind of shift you didn't hear so much as feel the way the wind carried a new scent pine sap and distant mud. And the morning sun began to linger just a little longer across Edgar's weather-worn porch. It was on such a morning that Edgar loaded all 3 pups into the old truck wrapped in flannel-lined crates and bundled towels, and headed down the mountain toward Miller's Pass. He didn't take them out often, not yet. Something deep inside told him caution was necessary, that their presence in his cabin wasn't just a coincidence, and that if he were to begin unraveling the mystery behind their strange behavior and scarred little bodies, it would have to begin with someone who knew how to see beneath the surface. That someone was Dr. Marianne Beck. Marianne had been the town's only veterinarian for the last 19 years. And in that time she had stitched wild coyotes, rescued eagles from fishing line, and pulled porcupine quills from the snouts of a dozen overconfident Labradors. But it wasn't her credentials that brought Edgar to her. It was her instinct. She had a way of watching animals like she was listening to them speak in a language most people forgot how to hear. The clinic sat on the edge of town, just past the grain silo and before the turnoff to the lake. It was a modest building, cedar siding, with a faded wind chime that never stopped singing no matter how still the air. As Edgar parked beside the wooden fence, the 3 pups stirred from their nests in the back seat. Their eyes bright but calm, their bodies relaxed but quietly alert. Ash was the first to hop out, landing on the gravel with a grace that seemed almost too precise. He moved ahead, tail low, scanning the perimeter before stepping to the clinic door and sitting with a soldier's posture. Nova padded beside Edgar's boot, eyes flicking from shadow to sidewalk. Lumen, though still favoring her right leg, moved with a cautious elegance, her gaze fixed straight ahead like she was walking into memory. Marianne met them at the door, wiping her hands on a towel and raising one brow in curiosity. "You finally brought them," she said, not as a question, but as a gentle acknowledgement of the inevitable. "I've been wondering when you would." Edgar gave a quiet nod, holding the door as the dog slipped inside with practiced calm. "They've healed up quick," he said, voice rough with road dust and early nerves. "Too quick, maybe. And they behave? Well, let's just say they behave more like a team than a litter." Marianne crouched as Nova approached, offering the back of her hand in silent greeting. The pups sniffed once, then sat a textbook gesture of submission, yet alertness remained in every line of her posture. "You weren't exaggerating," Marianne murmured. She turned toward Ash next, who had already positioned himself between her and the exam table. "This one's the commander." Edgar huffed a breath. "That's what I've been calling him. He's always watching the exits." She reached forward, slow and respectful, and Ash allowed the contact, though his eyes never left the far window. Lumen was last to step forward, and something in her movement made Marianne pause. The limp was barely noticeable now, but her gait was symmetrical in a way that wasn't natural. It had been trained back into her muscles. "Come here, sweetheart," Marianne said softly. Lumen moved forward with quiet dignity, her head level, her body tense but controlled. When Marianne placed a hand on her flank, she let out the faintest exhale. No resistance, no submission, just mutual recognition. Marianne guided them one at a time onto the stainless steel exam table. She worked methodically, checking teeth-eyes joints. Her touch was gentle, her murmurs low and steady. Nova passed through the process easily, her body pliant, her trust extended, as though she understood this woman was here to help. Then came Ash. He didn't growl, didn't bark. But his eyes narrowed the moment Marianne lifted his right paw. There, just beneath the fur, was a faint line of raised skin, healed almost invisible, but unmistakably the work of a scalpel. Marianne froze. "This is surgical," she said under her breath. "Clean, no suture knots. Probably internal dissolvable, done by someone who knew what they were doing." Edgar moved closer. "Not from an accident, no. She ran her fingers gently over the area. These aren't from getting tangled in barbed wire or fighting a coyote. This was precision, purpose. Ash pulled his paw away, then stepped off the table without being told. Marianne didn't stop him. She simply turned and nodded toward Lumen. Let's finish with her. Lumen was lighter, more reserved in her reactions. She let Marianne run her scanner over her neck shoulder's side. Nothing. Then Marianne moved the wand lower down toward her rib cage, near the joint of her back leg. The scanner beeped. Marianne froze. Edgar looked up, heart skipping. She waved it again. Another beep. Strong, centered. It's a chip, she said quietly. Edgar frowned. That's not uncommon, right? She shook her head. Not the location, not the structure. She pulled the wand closer, tapped the small screen, and stared at the string of characters that appeared. The first few digits looked standard, but then Marianne's eyes widened. This isn't a civilian pet ID. She stepped quickly to her desk, pulled up a separate terminal, and plugged the scanner in. The screen blinked to life, accessing a database Edgar couldn't begin to understand. Marianne typed rapidly, her fingers flying across the keyboard, a line deepening between her brows. It's military, she whispered after a long moment. Encrypted, partially redacted. But the prefix is... It's a Defense Department classification. K9 division. And the code, it's black program level. Edgar stepped back as if the words carried weight, his breath catching. She's registered under a tactical series. Marianne continued, voice quiet now, which means she was part of a working unit. Likely active duty or bred from one. Ash, sitting near the doorway, stiffened. Nova moved closer to Lumen. And Lumen... She didn't seem surprised. If anything, her expression, if a pup could have such a thing, settled into something like confirmation. She's not a stray, Marianne said softly. None of them are. Edgar exhaled. I knew they weren't normal. But I didn't expect... They're from somewhere secret, she said. And someone went to a lot of effort to hide it. These collars, their tags, someone filed them down by hand. These aren't dogs that got lost. They're dogs someone tried to erase. He felt something clench in his chest. You think they escaped or were left, she said grimly, or protected? Maybe someone meant for them to disappear. Keep them safe. Edgar's voice lowered, or maybe they're the only ones left from whatever they were part of. That thought settled heavy between them. Marianne turned back to her screen, reading deeper. It doesn't say much, just initials, a letter prefix, a 4-digit code, then a deployment date. That's the only thing that isn't redacted. She paused, then turned to look at Edgar. 14 weeks ago. His heart stopped for a beat. That's exactly when I found them. She nodded slowly. Outside the clinic, the wind had picked up again, and the clouds were beginning to roll back over the hills. The melt was short-lived. Winter still had things to say. Edgar stood in silence, watching, as Nova stepped up beside Ash, nudging his shoulder gently with her nose, and as Lumen padded quietly across the room to rest against his boot, the pressure of her body grounding him to the moment. They weren't ordinary pups. They were remnants of something designed, something trained, something built for a purpose neither he nor Marianne could yet understand. But in their eyes, in the way they moved together, in the way they watched and waited, there was a story trying to surface a truth just beneath the surface of fur and bone. And as Edgar knelt slowly to run his hand along Lumen's back, feeling the faint bump of that hidden chip beneath her skin, he knew the question had finally taken root in him. Not just where had they come from, but who had made them what they were and why. And somewhere out there in the world, still blanketed in snow and silence, he knew the answer was waiting to find its way back. The sun had already slipped behind the edge of the ridgeline when the phone rang. It wasn't often that Edgar's landline lit up anymore. Most calls, if they came at all, were from the post office in town, or the occasional neighbor with a fence to fix. But tonight the sound of the phone felt different, sharp, insistent, like it carried something heavier than words. He stood slowly from his chair by the hearth, where Lumen had curled herself into a quiet coma at his feet, and walked over to the receiver hanging beside the kitchen window. He stared at the blinking screen for a moment. Unknown number. Area code, Alaska. A cold instinct crawled up his spine, and his hand hovered for half a second longer than usual, before he lifted the phone to his ear. "Whitlow," he said, his voice calm, but lined with wariness. There was a pause, a breath, like someone had just been running. Then, "Sir," the voice cracked through the static, rough with exhaustion, yet pulled taut with discipline. I'm sorry to bother you. I got this number through a friend of a friend. You don't know me, but... Do you have 3 German Shepherd pups with you? About 4 or 5 months old now, one black, one tan, and one sort of silver with a scar on her back leg." Edgar froze. On the floor, Nova lifted her head sharply, ears pointed toward the phone. Lumen stirred but stayed pressed to the floor, while Ash, who had been pacing near the woodpile, paused mid-step and turned with a focus Edgar had only seen once, when a bear passed too close to the tree line. "I'm sorry." The voice continued, the tension in it building. "I know how this sounds. I know I shouldn't even be making this call, but I'm desperate, sir. I've been looking for them for months. Since the crash." Edgar said nothing, his hand tightening around the phone. "They were part of a team," the voice said. "I was part of it too. My name is Callan Reyes. I was their K9 support handler. Not directly over them, but I was close. Real close. I helped raise their dam. Her name was Vega. She wasn't just any working dog. She was legendary in our circles. One of the best tactical response animals the Army's ever trained. Calm under fire, brilliant at reading human behavior. She had 3 pups right before our last deployment." The voice broke just slightly. "We didn't even know she was pregnant until we were already in Alaska. The chopper went down during a covert evac. I was thrown. Broke my leg. By the time I came to Vega, and the pups were gone. Disappeared into the forest, and no one found them. They stopped searching after 6 days. I didn't." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I've been AWOL for 4 months. I couldn't leave them out there. Not after what Vega did for me. For all of us." Edgar's heart was thudding now, not with fear, but with something that felt older, deeper recognition. Not of the man, but of the ache behind his words. The weight of someone still walking through fire, hoping it might eventually warm him instead of burn. On the floor, Nova had stood now. Her body angled sharply toward the receiver, tail raised but still. Eyes locked on Edgar's hand like she could hear the voice across the static. Callan kept talking breathless. "I know they were found near Wyoming. I traced a signal ping from one of the chips, Lumens, I think. The data flagged in a veterinary scan database. That's how I found this number. It was listed as a temporary contact for the location. Please, sir. I'm not military anymore, not officially. I just need to know. Are they alive?" Edgar glanced toward Nova. She had inched closer, almost trembling now, not with fear, but with intensity. Her ears twitched with each syllable of the voice on the line. He turned his gaze toward Lumen, who had now lifted her head too. Her pale eyes locked on Nova, as if reading something through her. Ash hadn't moved. He was sitting squarely between the door and the rest of the cabin, his expression unreadable, posture rigid. Edgar lowered the phone just slightly and spoke. "Nova," he said gently. "Do you know that voice?" At the sound of her name, the pup stepped forward, making a soft, low sound, almost a chirp, before looking back at the phone, eyes wide, breath shallow. It wasn't just recognition. It was longing. The kind of quiet ache you don't expect from something so young, so small. Edgar brought the receiver back to his ear, cleared his throat, and finally replied. "They're alive," he said slowly. "Safe. All three." On the other end, there was a pause. Then a sound that wasn't quite a sob, but close. A choked exhale like someone had been holding their breath for 4 months straight. "Thank God," Callan whispered. Edgar didn't answer right away. He was still watching Nova, still absorbing the shift in her posture, the way her body had softened at the sound of Callan's voice, yet remained hesitant, caught between instinct and memory. "I need to ask you something," Edgar said, his tone calm but sharp. "Why did no one come looking for them?" Callan was quiet. Then, because they were never supposed to exist. The weight of those words was immediate. They weren't on the manifest, he continued. The brass didn't want it getting out that Vega had whelped on deployment. Said it was a security risk. They didn't know what to do with them. But Vega, she was smarter than any of them gave her credit for. I think she planned it. Hid the pups. She knew the chopper wasn't stable. Knew she needed to get them out. He took a shaky breath. When the crash happened, they chalked up the whole incident to a mechanical failure, wrote it off, buried the records. I tried to push for search teams. They shut me down. Said they weren't property of the Army because they hadn't been officially processed. Said I was getting too emotional. There was something fierce in his voice now, something wild and wounded. I knew better. I knew Vega. She would have done anything to protect her pups. And I owe her everything. Edgar's jaw tightened. You've been searching alone this whole time. I haven't slept in a real bed since December. I've been living out of my truck, tracking down rumors, following dead ends. Then last week I caught the ping on the chip. I couldn't believe it. I still can't. Nova had moved even closer now, her paws resting on Edgar's boot, her body quivering ever so slightly. She hears you, Edgar said, his voice quieter now. At least one of them does. Oh, God, Callan exhaled. Which one? The tan one, with the gold eyes. You said her name was Nova. That's what Vega called her. Short for supernova. She was the firstborn. She always had this spark to her. Vega used to press her nose to Nova's forehead, like she was trying to pass something into her. Some kind of strength. Edgar swallowed. That strength's still there. There was silence on the line again. When Callan spoke, his voice was steadier. Tired but no longer lost. I don't know what to ask now. I just needed to hear they were okay. You don't owe me anything. I'm sure you've taken good care of them, and I'm not trying to take them away. He stopped. I needed to know they weren't just ghosts in the snow. Edgar looked down at the pup, still leaning against him. He could feel her heartbeat through his boot. Steady, heavy. They're not ghosts, he said. But they're not ordinary either. I know, Callan murmured. They never were. Edgar hesitated. His eyes met Ash's across the room, and in that moment, he saw something in the pup's gaze that wasn't just caution, it was judgment. Like he was waiting to see what Edgar would do with this new piece of the story. He drew in a long breath and let it out slowly. I'm not ready to decide anything yet, Edgar said finally. They've been through more than I can imagine. And they've found something here, something that makes them feel settled. But I won't lie to you. Nova's reaction, it means something. I understand, Callan said quietly. I'm just grateful you picked up the phone. Edgar almost smiled. She did more than that. She answered it. There was a silence that held the weight of miles and memories. Then Callan spoke again. If I were to come that way, just to see them from a distance, would that be too much? Edgar looked at Nova, then at Lumen, who was now sitting upright beside her sister, watching him closely. I'll think about it, he said softly. Fair enough, Callan replied. Thank you, sir. For everything. He hung up first. Edgar replaced the receiver with a slow hand, the click of the cradle sounding louder than it should have in the quiet of the room. He turned to find all three pups facing him now. Ash at attention, Lumen still watchful, and Nova, eyes wide, ears angled forward, like she could still hear that voice hanging in the air. Edgar knelt down beside her, resting a hand gently against her back. What did he mean to you? He whispered. Nova didn't move. But the way her head tilted slightly, the way her body leaned just slightly into his touch, said everything. Some part of her remembered. Some part of her still belonged to the voice that called from the dark. And Edgar knew as he watched the fire flicker in her golden eyes that whatever story these pups carried, it wasn't finished. Not yet. The morning light crept into the cabin like a slow breath, sifting through the gaps in the curtains and settling gently over the wood floor where Nova lay sprawled like a sentry at rest, her chest rising and falling with that rhythmic calm Edgar had grown to rely on. Beyond her, Lumen sat poised by the window, gaze flicking from bird to breeze, with a stillness that never felt passive. Ash, ever the perimeter keeper, was already outside, his paw prints dotting the frost-covered ground around the edge of the garden, a silent loop of watchfulness. Edgar sat at the table, untouched coffee cooling in the mug beside him, eyes fixed on the landline. It hadn't rung again, but the echo of Callan's voice remained a quiet pulse beneath every thought, every breath. He couldn't sleep last night. Not because of fear, and not because of guilt exactly. Something deeper than both. Something that sat heavy in his chest and refused to be named. He looked down at the scrawled notes in front of him. A name, a number, coordinates, dates, everything Callan had given him. He'd written it all down like it was evidence, though part of him already believed the story. He didn't need proof. He'd seen it in the pups, the way they moved, the way they thought, the way they read the world, like soldiers read terrain. But believing the story didn't make the decision easier. They weren't his. That much was true. And yet, a sharp bark shattered the silence. Edgar jerked his head up just in time to see Nova bolt from her place by the hearth claws, skimming across the floorboards as she launched herself toward the door. Lumen followed fast, but quieter, slipping like a silver arrow past Edgar's boots. The third bark, deeper, more guttural, rang from outside. That was Ash. By the time Edgar made it to the porch, the three were already fanned out in formation. Ash up front, tail raised, teeth bared. Lumen off to the right body, low and focused. Nova standing squarely between the other two, chest out, letting loose a bark that was far too big for her size. At the edge of the property, just past the old vegetable beds, a coyote stood, frozen legs, stiff ears back, eyes darting from dog to dog. It must have wandered close in search of food, not realizing the cabin was guarded now. Edgar didn't shout. He didn't need to. In perfect synchrony, the pups moved forward in a triangle, tightening their perimeter around the intruder steps, measured and steady. They didn't lunge. They didn't chase. They asserted. The coyote hesitated only a second longer before turning tail and fleeing, its silhouette vanishing into the tree line without a sound. The pups held their line a moment longer, then slowly began to ease back, Nova trotting proudly up the steps, Lumen flanking behind her like a quiet shadow, and Ash taking up the rear, always the last to turn away. Edgar let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They're not just pups, he muttered, watching them gather at his feet. They're a unit. Nova nudged his leg with her nose-tongue flicking out in a gesture of satisfaction, while Ash simply stared, as if assessing whether Edgar had noticed every tactical move they'd made. He had, and something in his chest cracked open. Later that afternoon, as he sat on the back porch with all three lying near the memory, came uninvited but not unwelcome. It was early autumn years ago when the uniformed officer came walking up the driveway. No words were needed. Edgar had known the look in the man's eyes before a single syllable passed his lips. His son Michael had been gone for 3 days before Edgar ever knew he was in danger. A roadside explosion. Far from here. Far from home. They said Michael died instantly. They said it as if that was supposed to make the pain smaller. But pain doesn't scale like that. It just burrows. He hadn't spoken to many people since. Hadn't needed to. The silence had become his blanket, his armor, his world. And then 3 pups had arrived on his doorstep one night, like wind through a broken window, uninvited, full of cold and tremble, but glowing with something too stubborn to die. And now, they were guarding his land. They were protecting him. More than that, they were trusting him. He looked at Nova, then lying with her head tilted upside down, paws in the air, belly exposed, with the kind of trust that could only be given, never taken. Ash rested his chin across her back while Lumen, always the sentinel, kept one eye half open toward the horizon. Edgar rubbed a hand over his face. Was he supposed to return them now? To what? To who? To a man who said he wasn't even part of the military anymore. A man who had lost just as much, maybe more, but who might still be part of a world Edgar had spent years trying to forget. It wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about the part of himself he'd sealed off long ago, the part that still wanted to believe in something worth standing up for. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled paper again. Callan Reyes. The name felt heavier now. He reread the line at the bottom of the note. I just want to see them again, even if it's only once. Edgar sighed and stood joint stiff from stillness. That night, as the fire crackled low, he pulled out the old metal box from beneath his bed, the one he hadn't opened in a decade. Inside were folded letters from Michael, photos, a set of worn dog tags, a ribbon, a dried flower from a military memorial that no longer stood. He set it all on the table and stared at it. Then he looked at the pups. Nova had dozed off with her head resting against Lumen's ribs, and Ash lay beside the hearth ears, twitching in his sleep. They were born into a world of duty. But they hadn't chosen it. Just like Michael hadn't chosen to be remembered only for the way he died. Maybe it wasn't about who they used to belong to. Maybe it was about who they belonged with now. Edgar reached for the phone. He hesitated just before dialing, staring out into the dark. I need to meet him, he whispered. Face to face. The line rang once, then again. And somewhere miles away, a young man might still be waiting for a voice to say yes. The wind had shifted by the time the truck pulled into the gravel path at the edge of the clearing. Edgar had been waiting standing near the gate with his flannel jacket pulled tight across his chest, a thermos of coffee in his hand. And all 3 pups gathered close around his boots. Nova stood tall, tail wagging with slow, curious rhythm. Lumen was pressed low against the porch rail, ears forward, eyes sharp. Ash remained a few paces back, half shadowed by the old firewood pile like a ghost waiting for a sign. The truck rolled to a stop, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then the door creaked open, and the man stepped out. He looked younger than Edgar expected, though the weight he carried in his shoulders told a different story. Callan Reyes had a face that looked carved from long nights and cold mornings, gaunt cheeks, stubble that hadn't been trimmed in weeks, eyes a little too wide like he hadn't slept in a bed without checking the door in a long, long time. But when those eyes landed on the three pups, something broke open in them, a softness rushing up like light through dirty glass. Callan took one step forward. Nova froze. Lumen growled low, not threatening, more like a question. Ash stood, muscles tense beneath his dark fur. "Easy," Edgar said quietly, more to the pups than to the man. But then something changed. Callan knelt down. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He just lowered himself until his knees touched the dirt and his shoulders slumped like someone who'd been holding back too much for too long. Nova was the first to move. She took a single step forward, then another head tilted, her nose twitching at the air between them. Lumen flanked her cautiously. Ash stayed back, but his tail gave one slow wag, as if he was calculating risk with memory instead of instinct. Callan's voice broke the silence, barely more than a breath. "Nova." Her ears perked at the name. Then Lumen let out a soft whine and trotted forward, half running, half stumbling, tail wagging, body vibrating with recognition. She nuzzled against Callan's hands, her head pushing into his chest. And that was all it took. Nova followed tail high, licking his chin. Ash was last, always last. But when he reached them, he stood tall, pressed his head firmly against Callan's shoulder, and let out a low, steady breath. Callan's arms trembled as he held them. Edgar stood still, watching it all with something like awe. But then something happened he didn't expect. One by one, each pup turned its head and looked at him, not with confusion, not with guilt, with something like a question, a confirmation. Callan looked too, and for a moment no one spoke. "They've bonded with you," Callan said, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. "They're yours now, huh?" Edgar didn't answer right away. He poured some coffee into the metal lid of the thermos and handed it to the younger man. "Let's go inside," he said. "Cold out here." Inside the cabin, the fire crackled again. Callan sat on the worn couch, the pups curled at his feet in a way that was too orderly to be chance. Nova rested her chin on his knee. Lumen stayed close to Edgar's rocking chair. Ash, always the outlier, watched both men with an intensity that never seemed to blink. "They're not normal pups," Edgar said. Callan nodded. "They never were. You knew them, I knew their mother." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded photo. Edgar leaned in. It was a grainy image, a snapshot of another time, mud camo helmets, the glint of dust-covered goggles. In the center, a large German shepherd stood alert and focused, and beside her, a younger Callan with more weight in his face and less sorrow in his eyes. "That's Vega," Callan said. "She wasn't just assigned to us, she was one of us." Edgar studied the picture in silence. "She saved my life," Callan continued. "More than once. Saved a lot of people. She could clear a path through hell like it was a hallway." "What happened to her?" Callan looked at the fire. "We were on a recon drop, Alaska mountains, winter deployment. Unexpected wind shear. Chopper went down. We lost 2 men on impact. Vega. She wasn't accounted for. Neither were the pups. I didn't even know she was pregnant until 2 weeks before. Our CO wanted to send her stateside for the birth, but Vega hated to be away from the team." He paused, swallowing hard. "I went AWOL trying to find them. Hopped bases lied through my teeth, burned bridges I can't rebuild." He looked down at the pups. "I had a feeling they made it. Just didn't know where. I was close a couple times. Always too late. And now," Edgar asked quietly, "now that you've found them?" Callan didn't answer right away. Nova shifted in her sleep paw, twitching against his boot. "I don't want to take them back," he said. "I mean, not to the unit. They're not tools. They're not assets. They've done more than their share of duty. Edgar's eyes narrowed slightly. So what do you want? Callan looked up. And this time there was no trace of confusion or performance. I want to protect them, he said. The way they protected us. The fire cracked again. Ash stirred, then went still. Truth is, Callan added, voice almost a whisper now, I don't have a place to go back to either. My discharge papers are half signed. My records are flagged. I'm a ghost on their system. But if I can stay close, if I can be in their lives somehow, maybe that's enough. Edgar leaned back, his chair creaking gently with the weight of thought. You said they weren't just trained. They were born for this, raised into it. That kind of foundation leaves scars. Callan nodded. They're smart. More than smart. They remember commands most adult dogs can't learn. Nova can disarm tripwires. Lumen can read hand signals in the dark. Ash? He trailed off. Ash always knew when someone was lying. Edgar looked over at the young dog, who was still watching them, unmoved, unreadable. Figures, he said. Callan smiled faintly. I'm not trying to take them away, he said. But I needed to know they were safe. And now that I've seen that, really seen it, I can sleep again. The clock on the mantel ticked louder in the quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up. Callan rubbed his hands together, then reached down to scratch behind Nova's ears. She was the boldest one in the litter, he said softly. First to walk, first to bark, first to fall asleep belly up like nothing could ever touch her. Edgar's voice was low now. If you don't want to take them, what do you want from me? Callan didn't hesitate this time. I want to help them build something new, he said. A life, a future that isn't filled with the ghosts we left behind. And just like that, the fire burned a little warmer. The next morning arrived quietly with a kind of hush only a Wyoming winter could bring. Sunlight pressed softly through the window panes, golden, and still dust motes dancing like slow snowfall in the warmth of the cabin. Edgar stood by the stove ladling oatmeal into 2 bowls, while Callan sat near the hearth back, resting against the stone legs outstretched, and Nova curled up beside him like she had known him forever. Lumen had taken post by the window, alert but calm. Ash lay near the door, eyes half-lidded but always watching. It was Callan who broke the silence. She hid them. Edgar turned slightly. Vega Callan clarified. When the chopper went down, she must have known no one would make it back. Or maybe she knew better than to wait. Edgar set the bowl down on the table. Go on. Callan rubbed a hand over his face, gathering fragments from memory. I followed every scrap I could find. Rural vet logs, sheriff reports, rumors in the middle of nowhere. People talked about 3 small shepherd pups seen together. Always moving as one, outrunning coyotes, scaring off a cougar. One guy swore they dragged a boy out of a ditch after his ATV flipped. He paused, voice quieter. I kept thinking, how could pups do that? But if it was Vega's line, if she passed on her instincts and trained them early, it made sense. Edgar sat across from him. And Vega, no one saw her again. He swallowed hard. She must have stayed long enough to make sure they were safe. Then disappeared. Edgar's fingers curled lightly against the ceramic mug in his hand. Let me show you something. They stepped outside into the crisp air. The cold nipped at their sleeves, but the sun kept the worst of it away. Edgar led them around the cabin, past the stacked firewood, down a narrow path that curved behind the slope, hidden unless you'd walked it many times before. This way, Edgar set his boots crunching over hardened earth and pine needles. The pups followed. At the base of a mossy boulder, just under a ridge, there was a patch of dirt that had once been disturbed. Months ago, maybe? Covered now with leaves and snowmelt, but Edgar knew where it was by memory. He knelt down, brushed it clear, and pointed. Right here, he said. About a month after I found them, Nova started scratching. Ash joined in. I thought it was some leftover bone or squirrel den. Callan leaned closer. They uncovered a torn canvas bag. Edgar continued. Inside was a rusted emergency kit, a damaged radio military grade, and a heat blanket still folded. Someone packed it with intention. He opened the nearby tin box he'd hidden under a pile of stones for safekeeping. Inside were the salvaged pieces, the torn webbing, the cracked radio casing, the roll of gauze still faintly smelling of antiseptic. Callan stared at it like it was a relic from a life he'd never finished living. This was hers, he whispered. I think so. Lumen sniffed at the canvas, then sat back as if standing guard. Ash approached the broken radio, sniffed around it, and then almost tenderly placed his mouth around the edge, pulling it gently toward himself like a forgotten toy. That's not random, Callan murmured. We used radios like these to call in drones during recon. If Vega was with them, she could have tried to call for help. Edgar folded his arms, and when help didn't come, she made sure they could survive. Callan crouched, his fingers trailing over the tattered edge of the kit. She taught them more than obedience. She gave them a plan. They were already coordinated, Edgar added. Even as pups. They spread out in patterns when they hear unfamiliar sounds. They take turns eating, one always watches. Ash reacts to sounds from half a mile away. Callan looked up. Those aren't instincts. That's training passed down by a handler who loved them. Edgar's jaw tightened just slightly. She set them free, Callan said. Not because she abandoned them, but because she trusted they'd find the right path. She gave them tools and let them choose. They stood in silence, the forest gently humming around them. Edgar's gaze drifted to the clearing ahead. I've always wondered why they stayed here. Why they didn't wander off into the mountains or follow the deer trails like other strays. Callan gave a soft nod. They weren't running. No. Edgar replied. They were waiting. Ash dropped the radio softly and looked up at the two men. And Edgar suddenly felt the thought bloom fully in his chest, clear and unshakable. They weren't lost. They stayed because they chose to. Because something in the wind, something in the soil, something in the way. The cabin stood firm against the snow. Something told them this was safe. Something told them this was home. Callan's voice was low. They waited for someone who could see them for what they were. Edgar exhaled slowly, almost like a confession. I didn't know what they were. I just knew they needed rest. And maybe I did too. Lumen let out a soft chuff and nudged Callan's boot with her nose. I think Vega brought them as far as she could, he said. Then disappeared so they could live without the shadow of orders. Or war. Edgar studied the pine canopy above them, where golden rays filtered through like threads of memory. Where do you go from here? He asked. Callan looked down at the pups. I was hoping I'd know that answer once I found them. And now I think I go where they lead. Edgar smiled faintly. Well, you might want to ask them. I've tried giving them commands, and they mostly just look at me like I'm being polite. Callan chuckled. That's about right. The light shifted again as a breeze moved through the trees, and all three pups stood together facing into it, tails relaxed, but ears forward as if listening for something deeper than wind. Edgar watched them closely. They're not waiting anymore. No, Callan said. They've already chosen, and deep in Edgar's chest, beneath years of silence and worn-out pages of memory, the truth settled like warm ash in a hearth. They were never just survivors. They were messengers of something lost, and something still possible. And now, they had stayed, because sometimes what you run from is less important than where you choose to stand. And as Ash sat down next to the broken radio once more, teeth gently grazing its edge like a long-lost friend, Edgar knew they weren't unfinished stories. They were the beginning of something neither man had the words for yet. The air had shifted that morning, carrying with it the scent of something distant, yet strangely familiar. Edgar noticed it first as he stood outside the cabin stacking wood for the stove. A wind that whispered through the pine trees, carrying not just cold, but the trace of movement, life coming closer. Lumen lifted her head from the porch ears, sharp eyes narrow. Ash paced once, twice, then trotted toward the tree line with a low rumbling breath that didn't quite reach a growl. Nova sat her tail tapping slowly against the floorboards, eyes locked on the horizon like she knew what was coming, but hadn't quite decided what it meant. Then came the sound, soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Branches pushed aside. Voices hushed in a language Edgar didn't recognize, but that Callan, who stepped out of the cabin rubbing the sleep from his eyes, immediately did. They emerged through the snow-dusted brush slowly. Their shapes blurred in the dappled light until they stepped into full view. One tall man, thin but steady, his beard tangled with weeks of travel. Beside him, a woman whose hand rested protectively over her round belly, her face flushed from exertion and cold. And between them, a girl no more than 5, wrapped in a frayed pink scarf, her small hand gripping a worn toy bear. The moment their figures came into full sight, the 3 puppies moved, no hesitation, no bark of warning, no pause to assess. They ran, not with ferocity, but with a kind of joy that didn't belong to creatures wandering aimlessly through snow. Tails wagging, bodies leaping, they darted toward the strangers, as if returning home. Nova reached the little girl first, nuzzling her hand, then circling her legs with such precision that the girl dropped her bear laughing. Lumen positioned herself at the woman's side, pressing gently against her knees, offering warmth and balance. Ash stopped in front of the man, tail stiff but ears relaxed, staring straight up until the man's hand lowered and rested lightly on his head. Callan took a step forward, stunned. They know them. Edgar was still as if afraid a sudden motion might disturb whatever magic was unfolding. The man looked up, eyes landing on the cabin, then Callan. "Is this your home?" "Mine?" Edgar said, his voice steady. The man lowered his head slightly. "May we rest?" Callan moved without speaking, stepping down toward them. Lumen looked back at him once, then returned her attention to the pregnant woman. Inside the cabin, warmth filled the space with something more than firelight. Rami, his name, they soon learned, sat on the edge of the hearth, one arm wrapped around his daughter, Nia, while Salima leaned against the wooden wall, sipping broth slowly from a metal cup Edgar had handed her. "They found us," Rami said softly, as if the very act of speaking it aloud risked shattering the memory. "We had been in the forest 3 nights. Bears, cold. I had no way to make fire. The girl had fever. His English was imperfect, but heartfelt. Then he nodded toward Nova. They came. 3 angels with 4 legs. Salima smiled, her eyes shining. They brought us meat, rabbit, left it at the edge of the shelter we made from branches. They circled us at night, growled at things we couldn't see." Rami continued. "One taught us how to heat stones and place them under wet moss to steam warmth. One dug roots. We boiled them." Nia's fever broke. Edgar and Callan shared a glance. The knowledge passed through them like lightning. These were no ordinary pups wandering on instinct. "How long have they been with you?" Callan asked. "Since the 2nd week we crossed the border," Rami answered. "We walked south, quiet paths. Someone told us Vega helped refugees once in a village far away. They said she was a ghost dog, a myth. But when we saw her, she was real." Vega Edgar repeated. She came to us, Salima said. Guided us through a field laced with wires. We didn't know it was dangerous. She did. She barked, then disappeared. Callan's voice trembled. And the pups, she brought them. Then she was gone. Rami's hand tightened around his daughters. I think she left them to protect us. For a long moment, no one spoke. Nova rested her chin on Nia's lap, eyes closing in contentment. Ash stretched out beneath Salima's feet, guarding quietly. Lumen remained near the door, listening to the wind, ever the sentinel. Callan whispered 4 months. And they weren't just surviving. They were serving. Edgar nodded slowly. They weren't hiding. They were fulfilling what they were born to do. But how, Callan murmured. How could they have known? Edgar stared at the fire, watching the flames lick up the iron stove's belly. I don't think they needed to know. I think they remembered. The silence deepened. Later, Callan knelt beside Nova, brushing gently at the frost, still clinging to her fur. You knew what we forgot. That duty doesn't end in war, and loyalty doesn't need orders. Outside wind rattled the windows gently, a kind of rhythm that felt familiar now. Rami turned toward Edgar. We will leave soon. We don't want to bring trouble. But we wanted to thank you. You're safe here for now, Edgar replied. Rest while the fire lasts. Salima laid a hand on her belly. They gave us hope. I think the baby knows them already. Nia had fallen asleep, curled up with Nova like they were parts of the same soul. As night fell, and the forest wrapped them in darkness once more, Edgar sat near the door with Lumen beside him, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern. He thought of Vega. Where had she gone? Why had she chosen this path for her young? Callan walked over quietly. They could have run south, toward towns, but they stayed in the wild, with that family, in danger, cold, alone. Edgar's answer came like breath. They weren't alone. Callan turned to him. They had each other, and they had the memory of who raised them. The thought settled heavily in the room. Then Edgar added, voice low but certain, sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we make without being asked. In the flickering warmth, Lumen shifted slightly, her gaze falling toward the firelight, where Naya's sleeping form moved with each slow breath, peaceful, in a place that had once held only silence. And outside the window, barely visible beyond the trees, the shadows moved not with threat, but like something unseen had turned away satisfied. Because in this house on this night, the pups Vega left behind had found what even she may never have hoped to reach. A new reason to stay. A new reason to protect. And as the fire popped softly, sending sparks upward, like stars slipping loose from the logs, Edgar knew the past had returned, but this time it came with names, with stories, with faces smiling even in exhaustion. This time it brought something more. And somewhere deep in the forest, where the snow whispered over paw prints half buried in moss and silence, something watched and then faded away into the trees. Almost as if it had been waiting to be seen one final time. Snow fell with a strange stillness that morning, so soft it could have been mistaken for silence itself. Edgar stood on the porch with his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, watching the first flakes settle gently on the railing. He sensed it before he saw it, the unnatural hum in the air like tension stretched between trees. It was Nova who lifted her head first, her gaze fixed on the bend in the road just beyond the pines. Lumen followed, stepping slowly forward, body taut. Ash stood unmoving, yet every line of his small frame was alert, calculating. Then came the sound. Engines. Not the tired sputter of town pickups, nor the groan of snowplows, but something heavier, military-grade tires crunching snow with precision. And not one, but several. Callan stepped outside just as the first vehicle rolled into view, a matte black SUV followed closely by two unmarked trucks. Their windows tinted their presence like thunder under a bright winter sky. Edgar saw the symbol immediately, U.S. Army markings stenciled cleanly along the side. The SUV came to a slow, deliberate halt. Doors opened. Boots struck frozen gravel in unison. Out stepped a woman in her late 40s, her face chiseled with the kind of resolve that rarely softened. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, despite the weather, her coat bearing a row of medals that glinted faintly under the low sun. She didn't carry a weapon, but she didn't need one. "Colonel Genevieve Moss," she said flatly, flashing her ID. "Department of Tactical K-9 Research, Fort Clayton." Callan stiffened. "I know who you are." She glanced at him, her eyes hard and without hesitation. "Then you know why I'm here." She turned her gaze to the porch where Nova, Lumen, and Ash now stood in formation, shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, silent. Moss took one step closer. "They've been transmitting. One of the chips Lumen's reactivated last week. Auto-pinged our system. Our satellite tagged their location. I am here under full authorization to retrieve government assets." Edgar's voice was calm but firm. "They're not assets. They're pups," Wrong Moss replied. "They're classified K-9 offspring bred from military stock. The program they were born under is federally funded, protected under DoD secrecy protocols." She paused. "They are government property." From behind Edgar, Dr. Marianne Beck arrived. Her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, stethoscope still tucked in her pocket. With respect, she said, "You're talking about living, breathing creatures barely more than puppies. In this town, we don't let family get taken like cargo." Moss ignored her. A second vehicle opened. Two men stepped out with leashes and reinforced transport crates. Nova growled not loudly, but low and deliberate. Ash moved first. In one swift movement, he placed himself between the soldiers and the children watching from the porch. Naya stood closest, clutching her toy bear, her wide eyes flicking between the soldiers and Ash's poised stance. Ash did not bark. He did not advance. He simply stood a wall of fur and will. The soldiers hesitated. Callan stepped forward, placing himself directly between Moss and the porch. "I trained with their mother," he said, voice steady. "She wasn't just a tool. She was our teammate. These three, they're her legacy." Moss replied, "Then you should understand why they're valuable. I do. And that's why they should stay here." She narrowed her eyes. "You've gone AWOL, Lieutenant Reyes. I could have you detained for obstruction." "Do it," Callan said quietly, "if that's the price." Marianne looked toward Edgar, and he gave her a small nod. Within minutes, others began to arrive, townsfolk drawn by the rumble of engines and the whispers that something was wrong. Pastor Hill came first, his scarf flapping behind him, followed by Sam from the hardware store, two ranchers from the valley, and even Nia's mother, Salima, who held her daughter tightly as she stood on the porch. Each one said nothing. They simply stood behind Callan, one by one, until 20 people blocked the path between the porch and the trucks. Moss surveyed them with a practiced eye, reading them like battlefield terrain. "This isn't your fight." "But it is," Pastor Hill said gently. "Because when a being learns loyalty and chooses to stay with someone they trust, you don't call that a machine. You call that family." Nova walked forward slowly, stopping beside Callan, then turning to face Moss. Her eyes met the Colonel's with an intensity that felt nearly human. Lumen joined next, brushing against Edgar's leg before taking her place beside Nova. And then Ash, still stationed in front of the children, lifted his head. His small tail thumped once, then he stepped aside. Not retreating, but choosing to stand with the others. The silence felt electric. Moss's face betrayed no emotion. This is a military matter. No, Callan said clearly. This is a human one. She paused, then turned to her aide. Pull up the files. A tablet was handed to her. She scrolled. These three, she said, showing the screen, were listed under Project Helix. Classified. Their mother, Vega, was declared KIA after the chopper crash in Sector 7G. The offspring were presumed dead. She turned it off. Legally, they're ghosts. Then let them stay dead, Edgar murmured. Here. Moss didn't move. Callan stepped forward. I'll sign whatever you need. I'll take responsibility. You want to pin this on someone, pin it on me. Moss studied him for a long time. Then, to everyone's surprise, she stepped back. Fine. A breath seemed to ripple through the group. But understand, she continued, you've put yourselves on a list today. These animals, she caught herself glancing at Nova. These beings are special. Someone higher up will come asking. We'll be ready, Edgar said simply. Moss nodded, once turned, and with military efficiency motioned to her team. One by one, they filed into their vehicles and disappeared down the mountain road. Only when the last engine faded did the crowd begin to breathe again. Callan dropped to one knee, hugging Nova, who buried her face into his shoulder with a small sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. Ash returned to Nia, who sat down and wrapped her arms around his neck. Lumen leaned into Edgar, who reached down and ruffled the fur on her head. They didn't fight, Marianne whispered. They stood. Callan looked up, eyes bright. Because they knew. We would too. The snow kept falling, but this time, it felt like a blanket, soft, steady, familiar. Later that night, by the fire, Edgar stared into the flames, thinking of Vega, of war, of choices, and of all the things humans had called these pups, property assets, ghosts. But what they had proven today, standing in silence against a system built to erase them, was something far more powerful than any designation. They weren't waiting to be claimed. They had already chosen. And as the fire cracked and danced, and the wind tapped gently against the windows, Edgar closed his eyes and thought. They were never lost. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to see them as they were. And stay. And outside, the snow continued to fall, covering every footprint except the three that always returned to the door. Morning arrived gently, not with urgency, but with a softness that draped the treetops in silver light. In the clearing outside Edgar's cabin, the frost had formed intricate lace across the old wooden fence, and the sky, brushed with winter blue, held the calm of a day that would mark a turning point. Inside, Edgar sat by the stove, sipping his usual cup of strong black coffee. The three pups curled around the hearth like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their place. Callan stood by the window, eyes distant, but mind focused, his hand resting on Ash's back, feeling the steady rhythm of breath. They all knew what today was. Colonel Genevieve Moss had returned not with force nor commands, but with an offer. Or rather, a reluctant compromise born from a place of buried respect. The events of the past few days had created ripples that even the military couldn't ignore. And while the official files still listed Vega's pups as recoverable assets, the truth now stared everyone in the face. These weren't just dogs, they were individuals with bonds too deep to untie. Moss had sat down with Edgar and Callan the evening prior, her tone cooler than fire but warmer than before. She had laid out the three paths offered by the Department of Tactical Canine Management, like choosing a fate from a quiet but definitive list. The first, return to active duty, assigned to a new unit, trained and deployed as intended from birth. The second, custodial holding under protective military care, confined, monitored, studied for behavior and lineage. And the third, early retirement with honors, allowing each dog to choose their civilian handler and home under supervised observation. Moss had tilted her head and asked, "And who decides?" And Edgar, without missing a beat, had said, "They do." Now, the morning had come. No orders, no collars. Just 3 young creatures standing in the middle of the clearing, ears, perked eyes clear, waiting. Moss waited near her truck arms, folded, the same controlled expression on her face, though something softened in the corners of her gaze. A few members of her team stood further back, holding portable scanners and data pads. But even they sensed the ceremony of what was about to unfold. "We'll give them the full picture," Callan had said. "Every place, every choice. And then we trust them." It began with the base. The convoy took them first to Fort Clayton, where the gates opened to let in a vehicle far humbler than those usually rolling through. As Edgar, Callan, and the pup stepped onto the grounds, silence followed. Soldiers paused in their drills. Officers leaned slightly forward. Nova walked ahead, nose to the wind ears twitching. Lumen followed with curiosity, but caution. Ash kept close to Callan's heel, the way his mother once had. Instinct woven through memory. They passed the K9 training fields, the scent of discipline heavy in the air, the calls of handlers echoing across the grounds. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked a sharp-clipped signal. Lumen paused. A soldier stepped forward with a leash. Ash did not growl, but he stood tall. Moss raised her hand. No one touches them. The trio walked together through the open gates, past the sandpits and treadmills, through the sterile gleam of steel kennels. The handlers watched with a quiet reverence, some recognizing the familiar movement in the pup's gait, the same alertness Vega once had. Then, without hesitation, Nova turned. She led the way back toward the main gate. Lumen and Ash followed. Callan smiled. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. The base was in their blood, but not their future. Next stop, the farmhouse of Rami and Salima. A warm scent of cumin and cardamom greeted them as they stepped inside. The fireplace crackled gently, and little Nia ran up to hug Lumen, who bent her head and nuzzled the child's shoulder. Rami met them at the door with open arms. "Always welcome," he said softly, reaching to scratch behind Ash's ear. The pups explored like children, returning to a favorite playground. Ash inspected the corners of the kitchen. Nova sniffed the worn rug near the front door. Lumen sat beside Nia, while the little girl read to her from a tattered picture book. Hours passed in comfort, but even here the trio did not stay too long. As afternoon shadows crept along the windowsills, Nova stood and padded to the door. Ash followed. Lumen lingered a moment longer, her head on Nia's lap, before gently pulling away and joining her siblings. They stepped outside without a command, but with purpose. One place remained. The truck rumbled back up the snowy road toward Edgar's cabin. Sunset came in streaks of orange and copper, the trees tall and still like sentinels. The fire was already lit when they arrived, and the smell of stew drifted onto the porch. Edgar stepped outside, weathered hands on the railing, watching as the 3 pups trotted up the slope, not hurried but certain. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They came to him naturally, each brushing against his leg in turn, Nova first, with a nudge of her nose, then Ash with a small, loyal tap of his paw, and finally Lumen, who leaned in fully, letting her weight rest against Edgar's shin like she had chosen it as her place. But then something happened. Something unexpected. Nova turned and looked down the hill back the way they came. She let out a single soft bark. Then she began walking. Edgar frowned. "Where's she going?" Callan stepped closer, watching. Nova paused, glanced over her shoulder, and barked again, this time louder. Lumen followed. Ash hesitated only a moment before sprinting to catch up. And just like that, the 3 pups began moving not toward a destination, but in a direction that connected all 3 places they had visited that day. The base, the farmhouse, the cabin. Not once, but again, and again. They carved a path between them, a triangle of purpose. As twilight settled, they passed by landmarks, only they would remember a stump. They once sniffed a stream. They once crossed a place Vega may have once led them through. By the time the stars began to blink awake in the sky, the three had returned, panting gently, eyes shining. They sat side by side facing the humans. Callan's voice cracked as he whispered, "They've mapped it. A patrol route." Moss stepped forward, her breath fogging in the air. "They're not choosing one place?" Edgar nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the three. "They're choosing all of them." There was silence then, the kind that spoke volumes. And then, in a rare moment of departure from form, Colonel Genevieve Moss smiled, just faintly, just briefly, but unmistakably. "They just wrote their own retirement plan," she said softly. Callan laughed, a short, incredulous sound full of joy and awe. "And they're sticking together." Moss pulled out her datapad, tapped a few commands, and without fanfare, deleted the active status from each of their files. "Nova. Ash. Lumen," she said aloud. "Status honorably retired." She looked at Edgar. "You're officially their primary guardian." Then to Callan, "And their field contact." She turned to leave, but paused at the edge of the trees, looking back one last time. "They're the only ones I've ever seen who refused to be assigned." And then she was gone. Night wrapped its arms around the cabin once more, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Nova curled up beside the porch steps, her head resting on her paws. Ash took his place near the gate. Lumen, ever watchful, sat beneath the tree line, ears flicking with every rustle of wind. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the fire inside crackled gently into the night, one thought settled in Edgar's mind, like a final puzzle piece clicking into place. This wasn't just their home. It was their post. And they had no intention of abandoning it. But far beyond the cabin in the far dark woods, something stirred, a faint echo. Perhaps footsteps, perhaps more. And Lumen's ears twitched again just slightly, like she already knew what came next. The Wyoming sky in summer was a different kind of vast blue, so wide it could swallow your breath, dotted with clouds like ships crossing an invisible sea. The wind rolled gently across the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and pine, and in the quiet stretch between morning and noon, life around Edgar Whitlow's cabin had taken on a rhythm both new and deeply familiar. It had been 6 months since that winter day when Nova, Ash, and Lumen had chosen a path that belonged to no command but their own. 6 months, and now they were no longer small. Nova had grown sleek and strong, her coat darkened with age, her eyes quick and decisive. Ash's shoulders had filled out, giving him the build of a silent guardian, and his tail now curled in a quiet, steady confidence. And Lumen, always the listener, carried herself with the steady grace of an animal who had once seen more than her years should have allowed, now shining with a kind of softness rare in trained dogs. But more than their size or stature, it was their presence that had changed. They were no longer just survivors. They had become something else entirely, something gentler, more profound. They had become teachers. It started quietly with a request from Marianne Beck. The veterinarian had kept in touch, of course, visiting the cabin every month, not only to check on the pups, but also to watch with growing admiration the way they lived. She had seen military dogs come through her clinic before, nervous, rigid, waiting for commands that would never come in civilian life. And she had seen, too, the heartbreak in handlers who wanted to give them peaceful retirements, but didn't know how to bridge the gap between war and home. "I think they could help," Marianne had said one morning, eyes soft as she watched Lumen calmly lay beside Nia Rami's daughter, while the little girl stacked wooden blocks beside her. Help who, Edgar had asked. "Other dogs," she said simply. "The ones coming home." That was how the idea for Bridge Paws was born. Callan named it. Edgar organized it. And Nova, Lumen, and Ash brought it to life. The program was simple. Veterans and their K-9 partners could stay at the cabin or nearby farms for a few weeks. The goal helped the dogs adjust to civilian life with patience and guidance. And who better to show them how than three who had made that journey themselves? The first dog they welcomed was Bruno, a scarred Belgian Malinois who had flinched at every loud noise and paced relentlessly for hours. But something about Ash's stillness calmed him. The two would sit together, under the trees for long stretches, Ash watching the horizon, while Bruno, at first restless, eventually slowed his breathing to match. Then came Rika, a German shepherd so sharply trained she barely blinked unless ordered to. Nova didn't try to fix her. Instead, she simply walked beside her into the woods, nosing at flowers, chasing butterflies, and showing her that it was okay, just okay, to be a dog again. And then there was Yarrow, a Labrador mix with a limp and a mistrust of men. It was Lumen who worked with her. Gently, every day, she would bring Yarrow sticks, then drop them in front of Edgar and Callan, waiting for the moment Yarrow would do the same. On the seventh day, she did. Each success was quiet. Each step forward a kind of silent miracle. Word began to spread. Bridge Paws became more than a program. It became a place. Rami and Salima opened their home to families who came with children and veterans. And Naya, who now drew pictures of her dogs at school, began showing other kids how to approach them gently, with kindness and voice low. Edgar didn't try to run the show. He simply kept the gate open, made the stew, and let the dogs lead. One evening, as the sun bled orange behind the ridge, he sat with Callan and Marianne under the porch roof. In the open yard below, a pair of young twin boys tossed soft balls for Ash and Bruno to catch. Nova trotted alongside Rika and a teenage girl with hearing loss, who had begun using hand signs that Nova understood before anyone taught her. "They're building something," Marianne said quietly. Callan nodded. A path back. It wasn't just the dogs who learned. The children did too. They learned how to read silence. They learned that watching was sometimes more powerful than speaking. That safety didn't always come with noise, but often in the form of a quiet presence beside you, like Lumen lying beside a boy with PTSD. As he tried to fall asleep under the stars, her heart beat steady against his palm. The town noticed. Even the military did. Colonel Moss came back once to see for herself. She stood outside the fence for a long time, watching, as Nova broke up a squabble between two adolescent dogs with a single stare and a raised paw. "They're still leading units," Moss had said. "Just not ones we trained." She had left quietly this time without giving orders. One day, a journalist came. Then a second. Then someone from a documentary team. The story of the 3 pups that survived a crash, protected a refugee family, and taught battle-hardened dogs how to play again. It was the kind of tale people clung to when the world felt tired. But Edgar didn't care for the headlines. He cared for the sound of paws across old floorboards. He cared for the quiet moments when Nova would rest her head on his foot while he read in the evening, or when Ash would press against his hip when a storm rolled in, or when Lumen would bring back a pine cone, place it in his lap, and sit like it was a gift. He cared because these were not just dogs. They were his children. And now, they were everyone's teachers. The old man didn't like speeches, so when the town held a small celebration for Bridgepaw's success, he declined the podium and instead let Callan speak. The young man's voice was steadier now, his back no longer stooped from sleepless nights. He talked about duty, yes, but more about healing. About how sometimes the bravest thing a soldier could do wasn't marching into war, but learning to rest beside a creek again with a dog at their side. And as the applause faded and the crowd dispersed, Edgar simply sat back on the edge of the porch, a cup of warm cider in hand, and watched. The field below the cabin shimmered in golden light. Children ran their laughter like wind chimes across the valley. In the middle of it all, Nova chased a stick thrown by a boy, missing half a finger. Lumen lay in a patch of daisies beside a girl reading Braille. And Ash stood by the garden gate, watching over the whole yard like a sentinel carved from the land itself. And Edgar smiled. He smiled not because of what had been accomplished, but because of what he saw. That the world had changed, not by force, not by decree, but by 3 young souls who once had no names found on a snowy road in the middle of nowhere. Now, they had left a trail behind, one made of patience, quiet strength, and a kind of love that asked for nothing in return. As the sun dipped low and fireflies began to blink among the tall grass, Edgar leaned back in his chair and murmured to no one in particular, sometimes the ones who change the world are just 3 little dogs who once got lost in the snow. And below him, in a field full of daisies, those 3 ran like they had never known anything but home.